Well, good morning, Rocky Peak. How are you today? Doing all right? Hey, happy holiday weekend. You're the ones who didn't have plans, so we're so glad that you're with us today. But in all seriousness, what a great opportunity for us just to remember why we're celebrating the freedoms we have this weekend. And so can we just say thank you to the men and women who have afforded us the freedoms we have in our country. And so as we celebrate this holiday, let's just be mindful and grateful for them and the sacrifices that they've made. Well, good morning. My name's Joel. I'm one of the pastors here at Rocky Peak, and I'm excited for what we got planned today. But before we jump into that, I wanted to let you know next week, Saturday night after service, we're having one of our next step desserts. And these are an incredible opportunity for you to discover more about who we are as a church. And so if you've been coming for some time and you're just wondering like, hey, is this a place I want to sink into and set roots in and call home? We'd love to invite you to come out to this. It's a totally free event. You can go to our website, rockypeak.org. You can sign up or call the office this week, just not on Monday, and you can sign up for that. But it's an opportunity to meet with our lead pastor, Michael, and his wife, Lynn, and for them to share their heart about who we are as a church, and for you to just get a little bit of chance to share your story too. And so it's totally free. We've got some great desserts. Want to make sure that you have that opportunity to take that step of discovering more about who we are. Sound good? All right, yeah. I mean, come for the dessert if nothing else. It'll be a good time. Well, hey, I just wanted to jump into our time. We're doing something a little bit different today. We're wrapping up our Come Alive series that we started a couple of weeks ago. And this has been this conversation that we've been chasing after when we're looking at what does it mean when Jesus says he's come to give us life? Because Jesus said something incredible in John 10:10, these powerful words about what he came to do for us. And he said this, he's like, I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And that's a beautiful hope of what he wants to do in our stories. And at one level, I get what he's talking about. Like, okay, you defeated death, you overcame the cross, you arose from the dead, you've overcome my sin and shame, you've given me new life. And so I understand, Jesus, that someday I have the hope of resurrection in my life. But until then, what does that mean for me now? Because there are places of struggle and sadness and brokenness in my story. How about you? And I think what I want to learn and discover is, Jesus, can you bring some of that life someday into my life now? Like, can you do something for who I am now? Because there are places of despair and sadness that I want that life to begin to bring healing and restoration in. And so we talked about this last week, some of those graves that we experience, whether it's a grave of broken dreams in our story, or graves of fear and anxiety that just grip us as we go through life, or graves of bitterness, or graves of shame. The question that I have is like, Jesus, can you do something in those places? Because if all I have is a someday hope, then I'm stuck trying to figure out life now. And I don't know about you, but when I get stuck, I tend to fall into one of two extremes. One extreme that I fall into is I guess I just have to fake it and pretend that everything's fine, right? And so we can play that. That's like a church game that we learn, unfortunately, where we just be plastic church and we just put on the smile and everything's fine and inside I'm dying. And I don't know about you, I don't want to play that game. I hate that game. I want to figure out how, I'm done playing that. How do I be real about my story? But then as I learn to be real about it, I don't want to fall into the other extreme, which is to fall into despair about how life is now. Like somewhere between pretending and despair, is there hope for my life today? Is there hope that this life Jesus has for us can find us where we're at and do something new in our stories? And so that's what we've been chasing. And today we're going to continue to chase that. But instead of just me or Dre doing the teaching, we're going to do a conversation with some of the leaders in our church. And so we're going to come out and each of us are going to just be sharing from our own life and experience how we've wrestled with this and found Jesus and found hope in those places. So could you do me a couple of favors? Number one, message notes, if you want to get those out, you're going to see there's 0 blanks to fill in today. So you can just, it's choose your own adventure message notes. Write down what you want if something stands out to you. And then would you do me a favor and welcome our panel, welcome Christy, Neil, and Dre as they come on out. Well, welcome, friends.
Morning.
Good morning, good morning.
Morning.
So we've all had our coffee, so we should be okay for at least the 9 a.m. We'll see what happens next time. What we want to do is have a real conversation together, but in front of all of you. So, 3 of us are introverts. We'll see how this goes. But before we jump in, some of us are known because of our roles. Some of us, we have roles that aren't always seen. Could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit what you do here?
Yeah, hi, my name is Christy, and I'm one of the life group directors.
I'm Neil Johnson. I'm the lead life group pastor.
My name is Dre. I'm one of the teaching pastors.
Yes, there we go. That was quick.
Quick and easy.
Excellent. Okay, let's pray. Love it. Fun. So we just want to jump in and talk about some of these graves. And I know as we engage, we're going to just kind of share from our own life and our own story. And so, Christy, I'd love to start with you. But I belong to her. This is
yes, you do.
Is my wife, Christy.
Yes, you do.
We go together. I married up. I know that I got lucky on this one. But Christy and I have had the chance to do so many adventures in following God's call on our life together and our family. And so I know when we left Rocky Peak back in 2013 to go on this epic Canadian adventure, there was so much excitement in our story. Yet as we've lived it, adventure does not come without price tags. And we've had to experience that. And so I know for you especially, there were serious seasons of broken dreams in pursuing this. So could you talk to us a little bit? What was that like? How did God meet you in that?
Yeah, this is so crazy to me. This is actually a very full circle moment for me because Joel and I, we did move to Canada, but that moment got unleashed here by God in a weekend service in this very room in 2010. And it was a Saturday night service, and I was sitting there waiting for it to start. And the Lord just spoke really clearly and powerfully to me that Joel was going to be asked to be a lead pastor. And it was the first time he had ever put that thought into my mind. And I came home, I shared that with you. And then the next morning, some guy, I don't know, maybe you're here tonight. If you are, please say hi, because we've been talking about you for years. But some guy comes up to Joel and just says, hey, I just feel like the Lord wanted me to come up and tell you that you're going to be asked to be a lead pastor. And it was just okay, God, what are you doing? And 3 years later, fast forward, we got the call to go to Canada, and Joel accepted a lead pastor position there. And so that was 2013, and you guys sent us off beautifully from Rocky Peak. It was such an amazing time of saying yes to God and this adventure. And we've never, I'm a beach girl, I don't belong in the snow. But we were doing it. We were so excited and going all in on what the Lord had for us. And so we literally sold everything we had. We packed a few things in our little Honda and we drove to Canada up into the backwoods of nowhere on Lake Superior. And we started our life there. And my expectations were here. And what I didn't realize at the time was that God was actually leading me into obscurity, into a season of what's happening. He works in reverse sometimes, and he was stripping away. We were far away from family. We were far away from friends. We didn't have a church family. My kids started school really early, so my stay-at-home mom years were done, and I couldn't get a job because of my immigration status. And I found myself with these long days at home alone going, okay, God, why did you bring me here? What was the point of this? And, you can only get coffee with friends and clean the house so much before you just feel okay, what's happening? And that disappointment began to grow in my heart. It was a season of isolation. It was a season of obscurity. And there was a really precious verse that God showed me in that time. And I've never really talked about it before because it's just so tender to me. But I want to share it with you guys this morning. It's in Hebrews chapter 11. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Hebrews 11. And kind of the story of this verse is that it's about Abraham and Isaac and all these great heroes of faith who left their homes and to follow God's promises. And the part that it was open heart surgery for me reading this passage. It's Hebrews 11:13, and it says this: all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. Admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth, people who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. And therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And that passage was just it was like God was asking me, Christy, do you have the courage to believe that I'm building a city for you? Do you, if all you ever get to see of this move is you don't get to see the fruit of it, or you get to see the fruit from a distance, or maybe it's a generation away. Like, am I enough for you, in this moment? And it was a really big wrestle with God to be like, yeah, Lord, like you are enough for me in this moment. But I felt like that time really drove me into intimacy with God. It drove me into the Word. It drove me into this like close time with Him where I was just like, okay, God, like I surrendered my life to you and I'm not taking it back. And so that period lasted about 3 years, almost 3 years. Yeah. And, but what I found in those 3 years is that the Holy Spirit was meeting me in fresh new ways. And looking back on that time, those were some of the most intimate times with God. Like, I think God had to take me out of LA and put me in the backwoods of Canada to get my attention because I was so distracted here. And he needed my full attention so he could do what he needed to do in my life. And at about the 3-year mark, God actually called me back into ministry. And I got to, the church that we were working at hired me as well. And we got to launch life groups there. I got to launch Christianity 101. We got to launch Next Step to Joyce. We basically brought Rocky Peak to the Canadians. It was awesome. And
you were always in our hearts.
You're always in our hearts. And it was just so crazy to me because I felt like God was saying, Christy, you thought that I had forgotten about you. But actually, I've been preparing you the whole time to be the right girl at the right place at the right time. And amen. He's so good. You guys can clap for that. And so I really feel like from then on, it was like this brand new season that got launched. We got to see like 89 people get baptized in those first 7 months. And it turned into a beautiful, beautiful time. And so I don't know about you if you're going through a broken dream or broken season right now, but the Lord, Jesus is the real deal. He really is. And he is able to do the miraculous in your life. And he did it in mine. He did it in my family's life. And I believe that he can do it in yours too.
Yeah, that's amazing. I know like when we were in those dark years, especially, and for you, you've reflected on that and seen like, hey, that really created intimacy in deeper ways than you'd experienced. And I think sometimes when we think of intimacy with God or experiencing God, like we think of like euphoric worship or like, God, this is amazing and you're awesome, and he is, but sometimes the intimacy that we have to press into is scary or challenging. And I know that there were things that you reflected on that time where you would even say like, God, I feel like you've tricked me. Like, I feel like it was like almost bait and switch. Like, come on this adventure, it's going to be great. And then, ha, ha, ha. Like when we're looking out the window, it's minus 30 for like 5 months. And there's no hope of life. Like it was very hard, especially for you, because my role was a little more defined and clearer right out of the gate. What did it look like to engage with God honestly in those moments where you felt like he had deceived you and these dreams were like just all dashed?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely challenging because, I'd follow all of you guys on Instagram and I'd see you at the beach in February and I'd be like, I'd be in my living room. It's like minus 800 and there's 20 feet of snow outside. And I'm like, what is going on? God, did you trick me? Because you're in free fall mode. It's like you take that step of surrender. And I think that in that season, it was like, okay, God, like it's okay to have a funeral for my own expectations. It's okay to have a funeral for my own dreams, but I don't ever want to have a funeral for your dreams for my life. Like those, you can do exceedingly abundantly anything that I can imagine, and he did. But it definitely is a wrestle because I feel like, being buried and being planted feel like the same thing sometimes. There's a death. You go into the ground, you're buried. But if what you're planting is of God, then you know that it doesn't end there, that it ends in resurrection, that it ends in new life. Mm-hmm. And I think that, but it's tricky, that going
they
into
the same.
It feel the same.
Yeah.
They feel the same.
Yeah. I think what's so neat to see in that, like, as we went on that adventure, like, again, like, my role was very clearly defined, but, like, over those years, God was like, hey, Christy, I see you. I've got something for you, too. And it was just so beautiful to watch you not give up on him even though from all outward appearances, it could have been like, well, God forgot about me, so forget you. And then to see what he's done in our collective story. And like, I remember when we wrestled over this, it's like, do we go or do we stay? And we knew we had like permission to choose, but there's a sense in which God's like, but you'll miss out if you don't. And now I look at like the arc of the story and like who we are now. Had we stayed with you, we would have loved you and enjoyed you, but we wouldn't have gotten to become who God wanted to make us into for this new season that we're in now. And it's just really cool to see that. So I know, Neil, I see the mic, you got some thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking she touched on it. It's a beautiful thing for us to set aside our dreams for his dreams, but it's probably one of the most difficult things you'll ever do. Because it really is what we all do, I think, as human beings, is we create these dreams and how it will play out, and we actually live according to them, then say, hey, God, come with me on this dream I have. But that's not the dream he has. And so it's really putting to death our own dreams so he can bring new life with his dream in our life.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the questions I felt like God was asking me in that season was like, do you want the story that I'm writing for you, or do you want someone else's story? And ultimately, it's like, God, okay, I believe you, I believe you, and that led to that great freedom.
Yeah. Amazing. And like a lot of times, like the graves that we've talked about, the graves that we're wrestling with today, like there are some graves that they're more like places of deep sadness. Like that's what, like broken dreams are often like graves of just deep sadness. There are other graves that we've been talking about that are like more scary. I mean, it's a graveyard for a reason. Like, it's like, oh, this is a terrifying place. It's a place of death and sadness. And so one of the graves that we've been talking about is like the grave of fear and anxiety. And how that can have such a grip on us and kind of control our life. We actually sent out an Instagram poll this last week, and just of the 4 graves, like, hey, anyone that engaged in it, like, which one do you find that you wrestle with the most? And that was the one that the majority of people who took that poll said, like, this is the grave that has a grip on my life. And so, I think it's a very reality of what we've all gone through globally in the last few years. It's like the world got scary. The world felt very less safe. And I think it's the one that can grip us. And Dre, I know as we've had friendship before and coming back and re-engaging, it's been fascinating to see like this is an area that's had a grip on your life for a long time. What has that journey been like as you've wrestled with the grave of fear and anxiety in your story?
I think the word that anybody that wrestles with this could use is arduous, in a lot of different ways. And, I think back to when I kicked off the series just a couple of weeks ago, when we were going through Ezekiel 37, one of the things I had said was, for God to bring new life, we first need to acknowledge the death in the first place. And for me, with fear and anxiety, it's been difficult but beautiful to acknowledge not just how long this grave has been affecting me, but the depths to which it's gone. This has been something that God has hooks in me from early childhood. And I don't remember a specific circumstance or an event that led to it. I remember vividly being a fairly fearless child. I even remember in the late 80s, there was an earthquake and I didn't care. It was fine. And then there was a shift. And I don't know why, but I went from being fearless to being fearful of everything. And I think for so many of us, if we examine our lives, we would probably realize, honestly, we're driven by false narratives and false stories. And so from a young age, I was driven by this story that the world is a dangerous and scary place, and it's up to me to defeat fear. It's up to me to keep myself safe, and it's up to me to keep the people I love safe. And so often with fear, sometimes it can immobilize people. For me, it causes me to overfunction, in which I carry God-sized weight on my shoulders, that if I don't defeat fear, I'm not gonna be safe. My family's not gonna be safe. It's a very Peter Parker Spider-Man complex that I have with me. But from a young age, I began to be driven to be like, hey, if I don't defeat fear, my relationships are gonna fall apart, my dreams are not gonna happen, hurts are not gonna be avoided, and I can spiritualize it and say, if I don't step up to fear, then God's kingdom is not going to advance. And so again, it's up to me, and especially becoming a parent, I sit there and go, it's up to me to keep my kids safe. I need to protect them and put a bubble. And what I've learned looking back is while I've been thinking, well, I'm trying to fight fear, I've actually given into the idolatry of control. Because as I've been driven by this, it's never been, God, you're going to defeat this, is I'm going to defeat this, or other language use, I need to be enough to defeat this. And that for me has been the core fear that has driven me for so much of my life. What if I'm not enough? What if I'm not enough from my relationships, from my marriage or my friendships? What if I'm not enough to make sure that my dreams or my kids' dreams happen? What if I'm not enough to keep my kids safe? What if I'm not enough to avoid hurts or heal from these hurts? What if I'm not enough for God in moving through? And I continued to run with that narrative for so many years, and it continued to show me, Dre, you're not enough, because I was still afraid. And so that led throughout my life and in adulthood in particular. There were several years where I would characterize them as years of just spiraling. That I remember commenting to Megan once in the midst of it, I don't feel anything but afraid. That's the only thing I feel, is I'm just afraid of everything. That's what I'm good at. And I remember in one particular, one of my lowest points with it, my oldest, he's 11 now. When he was a baby, just a few months old, I was sitting here at church, and I don't remember what was the trigger, but I was just awash in a wave of fear. And so I left service, like even before worship ended, and I went and I just checked Gabriel out. I sat in the car and I just sobbed. And I remember Megan eventually came and she's like, what are you feeling right now? And I just went, what if he's afraid like I am? What if I've just given him the thing that is ruining my life? And God used that moment. I don't remember the exact words Megan said, but I remember the paraphrase that she said, well, then he's going to have you to show him how to trust God in the midst of it. And that was a turning point for me. Again, it wasn't exactly in that moment, but God began to put the pebble in the shoe to go, I'm trying to do this on my own. I'm trying to do this on my own. I'm not trying to do this with God, because up to that point, many of us know there are hundreds of do not be afraid scriptures in the Bible. And I would read them vehemently. I would pray, God, take these fears away, and he wouldn't. And I would sit there and go, well, clearly I mustn't be doing something wrong. Clearly I must not be enough, because if I was truly what God told me to be, then I would not feel fear. I would only feel courage. And what I came to learn in that moment is that that's not what it means to not be afraid. What it means to not be afraid is to feel your fear and know that God is walking with you together in that fear. What I realize is those scriptures, do not be afraid, has nothing to do with me, but has everything to do with the fact that God is together. And God led me in a journey that I'm still on to show me, because I would pray vehemently, God, keep me safe. Don't you want me to be safe? And as odd as it sounds, God's answer is no. Because if you were safe, you wouldn't experience how good I am. You know, I've mentioned that many times, that my favorite line in the Chronicles of Narnia when they're talking about Aslan is he safe? And the answer is no, but he's good. And I've realized, God, you're not pulling me from these situations that scare me, because it's the only way I can experience your goodness in a way I can't anywhere else. Oh, I need to run to you. You know, and one of the verses that really impacted me in this journey, it's there kind of in your note sheet in John chapter 6. It's that famous account of the feeding of the 5,000. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And again, this is an incredibly anxiety-producing question, because it's not just 5,000 people, it's only 5,000 men. It's roughly closer to 20,000 people. So the Staples Center, I refuse to call it the Crypto.com Arena, the Staples Center. And I can imagine Philip and the other disciples, their heart just sinks, and Jesus turns and goes, what do you think we should do? And it says right there, John adds this editorial comment later, he asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And in the false narrative I was living in, I took the word test as pass and fail. That's not at all what that means. Test is an opportunity. Hey, when you are feeling great fear, great anxiety, where are you going to turn? Because I'm right here. And I've learned to apply this to be like, okay, it's not about passing and fail. I'm scared. It is still a thorn in my side. But now I know I can turn to God. And that is one of the most beautiful acts of maturity, to say, Jesus, I am scared, but let's do this together.
And I think that's such a powerful idea, like when we're in the face of fear, because I know so often in my story, I've often, like false narratives, where it was like, Joe, you can either have faith or you can be afraid.
Yeah.
Like it can't be both. And then you look and you just read the reality of the people in Scripture and the things that they wrestled with. And it's like, oh, they were scared to death as they pursued Jesus, with the life God had for them. So for you, what does it look like to hold on to faith in the midst of fear, to not buy into that false dichotomy, but to recognize that faith and fear often are one and the same moment together? What's that like for you?
You know, very practically, I've had to learn to develop a rhythm of being honest with God. And I think sometimes we all want to think we're honest, but we have limits, I would say, a lot of times. And for me, my limit was telling God what I'm actually scared of, because I didn't want to sound immature. I didn't want to sound stupid. I didn't want to sound unspiritual. And again, I wanted to somehow believe that I could be enough. But what I've learned is when I come to God, it's not an either or, it's a both and. God, when I talk to you regularly about what I'm scared of, the small, the big, and everything in between, I have a greater sense of your presence and power with me. And so practically, I've had to kind of learn to let my ego go aside, because I've had to make this a regular part of my rhythm with God. But not only that, like for me personally, I speak these out loud to God, whether in my time with him, in the car, often, I just find that it makes it more real to me. But what I've come to experience in those practical rhythms is God promises us peace. And in the false narrative, I assumed peace was something I would get at the end, when I've defeated the fear. And the reality is I have not experienced peace at the end of these challenges. I've experienced God's peace in the midst of it. And it's sweeter and greater than what I could have imagined, even in the midst of these circumstances. So that's been a big part of my journey in that.
Amazing, good thing.
And that's, and I'm just grateful for those practical steps, you know, as God takes us, because I think sometimes we try to overcomplicate our spiritual lives. And the reality, it's something that we often try to say at Rocky Peak, it's going to be with Jesus. Is a lot of what is the changing factor. And that's true of all of our graves, but as we continue tradition, that has a significant impact in the grave of bitterness and anger and rage and all of those feelings. And so Joel, I want to toss this over to you, because as you shared last week, you definitely have some experience in that. And in particular, you said something last week that bitterness has a way of making you out to be a zombie. And to be cute, you've had experience as the Walking Dead, haven't you? So Can you share some of that?
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting when you discover that you're good at something that you realize you shouldn't be good at. Right? So like, I'm really good at being bitter. And I'm like, I don't know if that's a good thing to be good at or not. But like bitterness is such a weird dynamic, because there's like this combination of hurt and anger that is a part of the story that causes the bitterness in our life. And so the reason I like referred to it like being like a zombie is bitterness is an empowering emotion. So you feel like you're alive, but it's very destructive to the life you're trying to live. So you're actually like just a zombie walking around a graveyard, not realizing this is a grave that needs to be dealt with. And I think one of the things that I've come to recognize about the bitterness that surfaces in my life is that it doesn't start as bitterness. Like it starts as what I would just say an appropriate response to being wronged by someone, right? Like, so like, hey, I've been hurt by somebody. And so how I feel is appropriate. Like, ouch, you did that to me. Or I might even be a little bit angry about it. And I got to be careful even with anger. But like, it doesn't start bad. It starts with that. But if I don't learn to deal with that hurt, to deal with that pain, to deal with that anger, that's when it begins to go sour. That's when it festers. And that's when it turns into bitterness and begins to consume me. And one of the things that I've had to learn to do in the story of bitterness in my life is to just acknowledge it when it's there and then say, just how do we work on this together? Because again, like I don't always realize like, I'm a zombie. Like I'm just kind of walking around and I'm a hurt person who's hurting people around me. And you know, like sometimes I'll often hear it in my daughters reflecting back at me, like, you're not really that nice person to be around right now, you know, and you're like, how dare you talk to me like that? Oh, that's the bitterness, you know, like stuff like that. But it's something that you can totally be controlled by if you're not careful. I know, like in my story, even on the journey that we were on, it's been very easy to become bitter over some of the things that we experienced, the hurts that we experienced. It's a fascinating thing when you realize that church isn't a perfect place, and church is filled with hurt people, and yes, you're one of them, but those hurt people hurt you. And then you're suddenly like, what do I do with this? I don't know if you've ever been hurt by church, but it's real. And yet at the same time, it's like, it makes sense that we would do that because we're just messed up people trying to find life in Jesus together. And so bringing a bunch of messed up people together doesn't necessarily mean you have a healthy group. You have a group that's a work in progress. But for me, what I have to constantly remind myself of is like, God, what do you want for me that's greater than this bitterness? And how do I begin to access that and step into that? One of the proverbs that I'll often go to when bitterness is surfacing in my story is in Proverbs 19:11. And I love the second part of that proverb because it says it's a person's glory to overlook an offense. And I remember when I was younger, like, I don't understand what that means. Like, so, like sometimes like you need to experience life to understand scripture, and then you need scripture to help explain life. Like there's that dance at times. And so I remember reading that one time and just in a very deep place of just being frustrated with those who hurt me. And it was almost like I was saying like, hey, Joel, when it comes to bitterness, you've got a choice with what you want with that. So you can hold on to that offense. You could let that offense own you or rule you, or you can learn to let go of it as I help you and grab hold of something greater. And what's greater is the glory that I have for you. Like I've created you for glory. I've created you to know this beautiful thing in your story. But the more you hold on to bitterness, the more you're filled and consumed by that, the less you're able to grab hold of greater things. And bitterness is such a destructive thing in my story because when bitterness surfaces, it so consumes me in the present and it begins to rob me of my future. Because that's all I can do is hold on to this. And I'd love to tell you, and now I'm free from bitterness. Like I've learned, but what I've discovered is, God, how do you meet me in those places? And what do I do with the bitterness when it surfaces in my life and my story? And so even this week, it was so fascinating. I got an email from an earlier context that surfaced a bunch of stuff again. Because we experienced some pretty mean things as we were walking out of some past contexts in our journey of coming back to Rocky Peak. And, like a church that was rejecting the things that God wanted to do through us and then began to attack us because of positions we were holding, trying to be faithful to Jesus. And, it's one thing when people come after you. It's a different thing when they come after your spouse and then when they go after your kids. And you're like, are you kidding me? So at one level, that healthy desire to protect, but then it's really easy for that to sour and become an unhealthy thing. And, that's why I have a love-hate with Instagram when you have a lot of different people in your background. Because sometimes that story will pop up and you're like, they're happy. How dare they be happy? Right? Like, how dare they be enjoying life given what I experienced because of them? Is it just me? Right. And yet in those moments, it's almost like God's like, okay, what do we want to do with this?
Yeah.
Like, what do you want to hold on to?
Yeah.
Like, do you want to allow the bitterness to rule you, or do you want to experience something greater that I have for you? And that's the journey of trusting Him with that grave.
Yeah. Joe, you once said that bitterness is a seemingly empowering emotion. I think a lot of us can relate that when we feel that rush of anger or rage, it almost makes us feel stronger, like we're doing the right thing. How have you wrestled with that temptation yourself?
Yeah, bitterness can almost be like a drug, and I want more of it because I feel empowering. But but any drug that you get addicted to, and in time it just imprisons you. Yeah. And so I think there's that realization, like, God, what does the path of freedom look like from this place of bitterness? And we talked a little bit about this last week, but Paul will talk about this. Colossians 3:13. He'll say, bear with one another and forgive whatever grievances you have with one another, which is hey, that should clue us in right there. We're going to need to figure this out together because if I need to learn to bear with you, there's probably some things in the story that we're going to need to work out. But then he says those beautiful words, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And that's when you begin to realize, is that the path to freedom, Jesus? Is that what it looks like? Because when I experience bitterness, because there's hurt in that story, it turns me inward on myself. And so I become consumed with myself in what's going on in my life. And then there's this beautiful invitation that God has for us through forgiveness. And what forgiveness begins to do is it begins to help me get over myself and to look beyond myself to the possibility of something greater in the story. But that path of forgiveness is so hard to do because it's I don't want to. God, I don't want to forgive them. I want to feel powerful and hold on to this. Yeah. And that's where I think He's okay, you've got a choice. Yeah. What do you want to do with this? And forgiveness is realizing I'm not letting them get away with it. I'm giving them over to Jesus.
Yeah.
and letting him deal with it. But to forgive as the Lord forgave me also requires that I need to step back and stop looking at them and look at what he's done for me. Because that's where then I get a bigger picture that becomes the surface, and I realize I'm not simply a victim in this world, I'm also a culprit. Because there are people that walk in bitterness because of me. And God, thank you that you've had grace and mercy on my story. So can you help me to share the forgiveness you've given me? Can you help me take this and just say, okay, they're yours, and I'm releasing this to you so I can step into something greater with you? And again, like there's days where I'll wake up and immediately that the story, it's like if bitterness is like a fire, it's like, oh, somebody's been stoking this while I've been sleeping. Oh, that's my subconscious. We're still dealing with it. And I have to choose as I get out of the bed, today I choose glory over bitterness. Today I choose the story you have for me. So help me walk in that freedom.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think sometimes there is a, quote, Christian narrative around forgiveness, that it's when you experience it, it's like a switch going on and all is good. But the reality is that forgiveness is a journey we have to cultivate each and every day. And we can gain victory in it, but we still have to walk in this journey. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think like there's so many beautiful things that we're taught as followers of Jesus that I think we can sometimes take and make trite, or, you know, it's a little sticker that we put up, and we live these deep things in shallow ways that we miss the power of them. I think forgiveness is one of those things that we have this expectation, like, I forgive, so we should be done with this. And it's like, well, no, forgiveness is a choice that now becomes a lifelong journey. And so, like, Lord, today I need to choose forgiveness again because the hurt is still here. And so can you work in me again? And there's times where I honestly feel pathetic. Like, I'm like a pastor in your church, and I'm in this place again. But I need to come to you because I need you. And then that's where I'm suddenly reminded, oh, that's why I need Jesus. Because I am a bitter man. And you've come to bring life in my story and to not beat myself up when it surfaces, but instead to come to him and say, can you do it again? Can you bring freedom into my story? Because I'm entrusting this to you once more.
That's awesome. Neil, I remember in our conversation last night, there was something you had shared about that. What if you wouldn't mind?
Oh, yeah, sugar.
You know, with cancer, right? Cancer is created by tumors, right? And so oftentimes these graves, bitterness being one of them, but I would say all the graves are what I would call tumors, right? And like Joel shared, he said, you feel powerful when you're holding on to these things. And yet it's really a tumor growing in your life. And we all know that, well, maybe not all of us do, but sugar is something that feeds tumors. So when you have a tumor, you shouldn't be eating sugar because, you know, you're trying to get rid of the tumor. And I said last night that it's like when we hold on to bitterness, these broken dreams, and no, I want my dream, or fear, anxiety, shame, or any of the other graves, it's like it's Satan's sugar feeding the tumor, right? You're choosing to allow Satan to feed the tumor. And that brings what you were saying, that brings death. But what brings life is forgiveness. God allowing the great physician to come in to change your heart, to choose forgiveness, which removes the tumor and brings new life.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you. You know, one of the things about God bringing life into these graves is that one of the ways he does that is, in a sense, by bringing the darkness into the light. And one key way that we do that is by talking about it with the Lord, by talking about it with the gift of community. But again, because these are graves, that's not always an easy thing to do, is it? And in particular, I would say that some graves are even harder to talk about than others. And I would say that the grave of shame is one of the hardest ones to bring to light and to talk about it because of the unique way it tends to get its grips on us and just continue to be that voice in our heads. And so, Neil, as we go to you, for anybody that knows you, you are not only an incredibly compassionate leader, but you are a appropriately confident leader. But yet that wasn't always the case. A lot of your story was marked by shame. And so can you share about that?
Yeah. This is like, I don't know always how to start out. So I start out with just telling you where it all started, which is the beginning. And, you know, I grew up in a very small town in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And we were what I like to say like a lower middle class or upper lower class family. We lived in a double wide trailer on an acre of land. 4 of us kids shared one room, bunk beds, and my father was a pretty angry and abusive man, and I was a really driven kid. So those two didn't always mix really well. But I was a good athlete, and I did really well in school. And so because I wasn't receiving accolades from my father, I sought accolades in other places. And, I performed so that I could get those accolades. So I performed in school so I could get the accolades. I performed in sports. I played soccer so I could get accolades, and I got a lot of them. And eventually those accolades just didn't work. It was like a false pill or something. They just didn't. It wasn't a salve to my heart anymore, and so I discovered pornography. And it was around my house everywhere. It was easy access. And so that helped to numb the pain in my life, which was pretty deep just from my father wounds. And so I kept running after pornography. And shortly thereafter, discovering that, my family befriended a young man. And when I say young man, it was a man in his mid-20s. And he was a photographer at a newspaper in our little town. And he would often come out to all of mine and my brother and sister's sporting events, and he would take pictures, and then often I would go with him to the darkroom and develop those pictures, and he just became a really close family friend. He became such a close family friend that my parents would allow him to spend the night at our house, and he would sleep on the floor between our bunk beds, and I slept on one of the bottom bunk beds, and many nights I found his hand down the front of my pants, and I would freak out, and I would move to the side of my bed, and I would slap his hand away, and that just drove me deeper into pornography because I had to prove that that's not who I was. And so it was a very painful time in my life, and what it revealed to me was that there was a huge hole in my heart. Like I was trying to fill it with everything, and the pornography would numb it for a little bit, but it was just back again, and I didn't know how to heal that hole, and so I started just running after anything. So psychics, astrologers, New Ageism, Buddhism, Hinduism, you name it, I went after it, and it all was a dead end as well. And for those of you who don't know, I used to live right down here at Topanga and Devonshire. I rented a house with 4 friends, and we were all going to Cal State Northridge, and I used to drive up to Topanga Canyon, to Santa Susana Pass Road, to Box Canyon Road, and if you go up there, there's a big rock right there. It's still there to this day. I pulled my car off, and I would sit on that rock overlooking Simi Valley at sunset, meditating, Buddhism. And one day I was coming back, and I saw the church at Rocky Peak, and I didn't want to go to a cult, although I was pursuing one. So I called my friend. I used to work at Price Club, and yes, it was called Price Club, not Costco back then.
It's a throwback.
I opened the store in Northridge in 1990. And so I called him. I knew he was a Christian. He was a great guy. And I said, hey, I'm thinking of going to this church. Do you know anything about it? He goes, oh, that's the church I go to. You want to go with me? And so I started attending church in 1991 here at Rocky Peak, and eventually gave my life to Christ in 1992, got baptized in 1995, May of 1995. And within 6 months, unfortunately, I'd fallen away. I had moved to the west side of LA. I didn't have a job at that time, and so I had a friend who called me up and said, hey, I'm driving strippers around. It's good money. Do you want to do that? And I said, no, I'm a Christian. I can't do that. So within 2 weeks, when I was broke and had no money, I called him back and said, hey, can I drive the strippers around with you? And so I'm not proud of it, but eventually I asked one of those strippers to marry me, and she said yes. And that became a pretty dark spiral in my life. I'd never shared with her about God or that I believed in God. And shortly thereafter, I had befriended this guy on the west side of LA, and we became really close friends. And he said, hey, man, you should come hear my wife sing. And I said, well, where does she sing? And he said, the church at Rocky Peak. And I knew then that God was calling me back. And that's why I call him the Hound of Heaven. Like, I don't know about you, but he never gives up on us. When you're his, he never gives up on us. And he is like a bloodhound. He will come after you, and he came after me hard. And so I started going back to church, and obviously that created a huge rift in my marriage at the time because I had never talked about God. And so eventually she left me. I've never seen her again to this day. She had 3 affairs and a child by another man and created a very dark time in my life. And one night I remember she had called and she was just saying such hurtful things. And I remember just putting the phone down and walking to the kitchen. And I was milliseconds from attempting suicide. And in that moment, I heard the Holy Spirit say, call Andre. Andre was the guy that invited me back to church to hear his wife sing, and so I did. And this is a man who never had his phone on at night. And he picked up, it was 3 a.m, and he said to me, Neil, just don't do anything until I get there. And so I didn't, and he just sat and he cried with me, and he loved me until it was safe for him to leave. And so then, after that, I did everything to save the marriage. I fought so hard, and she didn't want to have anything to do with me, so she eventually was going to get remarried, so she filed for divorce, and she sent me the divorce papers, and I held on to those for 6 months, and then eventually signed them and sent them in. It was in that time that about 2 a.m, and this is going to sound really crazy to some of you, because it sounded crazy to me before when anyone would talk like this, but all I can say is it's what happened, and it changed the whole trajectory of my life. So it was about 2 a.m, and like any good student, I was reading the Bible, and the way you read a book is you start at the beginning of the book. So I was in Genesis, and I was in Genesis 3, and about 2 a.m, like a ticker tape, like the stock market, like a ticker tape, 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3, 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3, 1 Peter 5, 2 and 3. And it was silent, but it was banging in my head. And I sat up and I audibly said, okay, Lord, I'll read it. And then I thought, is there a 1 Peter? Because I may have known John 3:16, but I did not know anything in the Bible. And I flipped to the front like a good student, went to the table of contents, and I'm like, I guess it's not here. But the problem was I hadn't gone all the way to the bottom. So I kept going where 1 Peter is. I'm like, there's a 1 Peter. Flip to the back, page 1,722. Oh, that was a joke. It's all the way at the back, in other words. I flipped it open. Now I see if there's a chapter 5. And then I went to verse 2 and 3, and it says, it's on there on your note sheet, be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing as God wants you, not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And so I knew in that moment he was calling me to be a pastor, and I don't know how I even knew that, but I knew it in my heart, and I just thought, how, God? Like, look what I've done. The shame and the pain was so deep. And yet he kept loving me. And he used the church, and he used his word, and he used really great Christian friends just to keep encouraging me. And so I remember saying, God, whatever you want is all I want. I will do whatever you want. I will clean toilets. And so I started serving in 3- and 4-year-olds. And so, really, I only did that out of obedience. That I thought I hated kids, and yet he kept asking me to serve in children's ministry. I'm like, what? So I did, and I served in there for 4 years, and it completely and totally changed my life. Some of you in here, maybe some of the kids that I taught, many of you are married and have your own kids now, but I remember in that time that I also read the book of Job, the entire book of Job. That's why it says on your note sheet, Job 1 to 42. Because God led me to it, and I started reading, and he was the most faithful man on the face of the earth, and God allowed everything to be taken from him. And I remember at that time thinking, I am not the most faithful man. I have been evil. And yet, I knew that God used that book in my life 3,500 years later to direct me to Jesus, because he is faithful. God is faithful, and he has plans for my life. And so that book changed my life. And it's an odd book to think change your life, but it changed my life because it made me realize that God can do anything in anyone's life, allow anything in anyone's life, and he's still good no matter what. God is either good all the time or he's not, and I choose to say that he's good. God is bigger than my shame. God is bigger than my pain. I am not my shame. I am not my pain. I am who he says I am. And he says that I'm a child of God. And so he changed my story, and he rewrote my story. And my life is not about my shame. My life is about my story, live for his glory. And so in Romans 8:28, it says, and we know this, that in all things God works together for good for those who love him and who are called according to his purposes. And I want to be really clear. It doesn't say God works together for good for everybody. It says who are called, who love him and who are called according to his purposes. And I love God. I love Jesus so much. And I know that's why he's taken my story and he's changed my story.
Neil, thank you. Neil, your story is one that God's life redefines everything about us.
Yeah.
And I think similarly to the stories we've heard before, again, it's not just that switch. It is a daily thing that you need to walk in and remind yourself. And so as an encouragement for what I'm sure it's safe to say, the many that are here or watching online, that shame has a grip in them. What is that like day to day to have to remind yourself that you are now living in God's narrative, not the narrative of shame anymore?
I have to remind myself continually. And I would say this, I think one of you touched on this. Because God took care of the shame in that moment doesn't mean he takes care of the shame every moment, every day. I have to run to him and surrender my shame, my cancer, my tumor. I have to surrender that over and over because there are so many times that I'm like, God, after all I've done, like, why? And it's just Satan. It's Satan's sugar trying to feed that tumor. And it's a dead-end road. And God is bigger than my shame. And so I am not that story. I'm a new story. I'm a new creation. I have been given life and life to the full in him. And so I have to remind myself of that. I have to go back to his word. I have to allow the stories throughout the Bible to remind me. Look at Peter. Look at Paul. Look at the woman at the well. Look at the woman who was bleeding. All those people's stories changed the moment they met Jesus. And it's because of Jesus. And Jesus changes everything.
And I love how you use that analogy, like he's the hound of heaven pursuing us. I think that's something that's so important that we can miss, because shame is one of those things, like when we experience that, immediately we want to hide, immediately we want to isolate. Like I'm not going to church. I'm going to give. Like I'm not going to pursue God. And I love that idea. Like Jesus didn't say, "Climb the mountain to find me." Jesus came to find us.
That's exactly
and
right.
So when we want to hide from shame, I think what Jesus is like, no, come to me with all of that. So I can do something new in the story. And I think that's one of the things I've just come to appreciate about who you are as friend, but also leader in our church, is like God can redeem a story.
Yeah.
God redeems stories.
Yeah. I don't need to wear fig leaves anymore. I don't need to.
Yes, other than when we're swimming. But,
Right, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like the reason Adam and Eve put on fig leaves is because they were ashamed. I don't need to wear those anymore. I need what I need to do is run after him.
Yeah.
He ran so hard after me. Like how could I not but give everything to him? Right?
Love it.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, Neil, one thing that I love about your story is how God brought new life into your story by using community. By using the church as a whole, but especially by using a small group. And again, that's why for us as a church that these weekends matter, but also why as a church we've invested heavily in our small group ministry, because we really believe that life groups is where the substantial growth happens. And so just real quick, as we start winding down our time, you know, that's one of the intentional reasons why we have 2 members of our life group team here. And so I'd like to ask each of you, Christy, starting with you, what difference has that made in your story with the broken dreams and the graves to be able to walk through that with community?
Yeah, I think the passage that comes to mind for me is just that verse in Revelation where it says they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. And I think that there's so much power in sharing our stories with each other, sharing our broken dreams with each other, sharing our shame or anxiety or bitterness, because we have to process those things. And as we share our stories with each other, it's like we're casting vision for someone else who might face that, 10 years down the road. And when they share their story, they're speaking vision into our lives too. And, we were not made to live alone. We were not made to be in isolation. And so I just really feel like life groups is just such a beautiful place for that to take place naturally, for us to share and just practice that narrative of faith that we need to rehearse. We need to rehearse that on a weekly basis. And I feel like life groups really provides that opportunity.
That's awesome. Neil?
Yeah, well, you guys know my story, but a life group changed my life. Before life groups or life groups at Rocky Peak, way back, I joined a group of men full of shame. I was full of shame when I joined that group of men, and that group of men changed my life. I was completely broke at the time, and I remember showing up the first night, and I'm an introvert, so I struggled actually walking through the door. But I got there, and when I did, they had food. Every single night I think I was in this group for 2 years. They did a whole meal. They don't have to, by the way. That's not a requirement, just so everyone hears that. But this group did that, and they never asked me to pay a dime. And then they just let me be a part of the group. And I didn't have to share anything. And for a long time, because I'm an introvert and because of my shame, I did not share anything. And then they just kept loving me, and they kept loving me, and they kept loving me. And then I threw a little pebble of my shame into the water, so into the group. And it stayed in the group. It didn't go anywhere. And then I was able to share more deeply and more deeply and more deeply. And it's what God used a life group as a place of trust and safety to be able to help change my story and my narrative. And those men loved me so well that I was able to share my entire story, and they continued to love me even though of my story. And that changed my life. And so I would say that to you, that life groups are a place that can change your life. But it takes putting your foot in the water, right? You have to step into it. And when you do, these are places that can change your life.
And what I love about that is putting your foot in the water is one step more than just showing up.
That's exactly right.
It's opening up and being vulnerable, because again, that's where God brings healing in life. And I'm excited because, as many of you know, we're about to celebrate the end of our current life group session, but it's not too early to begin thinking about the fall and what God wants to do. And by making that an intentional part of our plan. And also in Neil's story, we need some good men and women at Rocky Peak Kids. Look at the difference it made in this guy. And so we're always looking for that as we go through. So as we go ahead and wrap up and transition out of it, first and foremost, can we just thank everybody that just shared so wonderfully and beautifully? Thank you all for sharing that and going in. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to transition out, and we're going to close like we usually do with a final song of worship. But I want to go ahead and give you one last encouragement as we go through. Earlier this week, as we were kind of talking through what God wanted to do in this, as Neil and I were talking, he shared with me again in his daily journey that he continually listens for the Lord to remind him that that's not who you are anymore. And I want to pray that over us right now, because all of our graves are different. For those of us that are up here sharing, we're not up here sharing because we've arrived at these places where these things no longer have a grip on us. These are thorns in our side, just like Paul dealt with a thorn in our side. But because of Jesus, these graves no longer are the narrative in our lives. When we gave our lives to Jesus, Jesus says, now I am your narrative. You are now part of my story, part of my narrative. And whatever your grave may be, it may be the broken dreams, the fear and the anxiety. It may be the anger and the bitterness. It may be the shame. It may be something else that we didn't talk about this. The message as a Christ follower that Jesus says is that's not who you are anymore. And it's a journey, and be encouraged, Rocky Peak, that sometimes when we experience victory in this journey and then we experience a setback, we think that we start at ground zero again. And that's not how this journey works. We're continually to move forward, and sometimes we're running. Sometimes it feels like we're crawling, but we're never alone in this. And so again, the whole purpose of this series has not only been to acknowledge the graves in our lives, but it's been to celebrate the truth that Jesus brings life where there was once death. Your grave, your hurt, your shame, your sin, what you've done to others, what they've done to you, that does not define you anymore. Jesus the King is what defines you. And so to close out appropriately, we're going to sing a song called Graves into Gardens, because what a beautiful image that where there was death, God brings life. And as we sing this song, I want to encourage you, like we did when we kicked off this series, feel free to get rowdy with it, Rocky Peak. Feel free to cry. Feel free to belt out of tune. Feel free to move around. Feel free to just receive whatever the Holy Spirit wants to do, but you have freedom in this time. So I'm going to invite you to go ahead and stand, and I'm going to pray to lead us into this time. King Jesus, you and you alone bring life. You said on your cross, it is finished. And what is finished is sin being our story, death being our story, shame, brokenness being our story. And now we are part of your story, Jesus. And your story is life and life to the full. And so here we are, Jesus, many of us dealing with hurts and pains and shame and brokenness. And yet we can still declare that we have life because of you. And we can ask for more, Jesus, because you give it freely. And so whatever the grave in our life is, you bring life. That's what you do, and that's who you are. You said, I am the resurrection. And here we are as your church to say, we believe that. We declare that. We live in that narrative. And so as we sing freely that you do create gardens where there was once a grave. And that is not just true of other people. That is true of me. That is true of us because of your goodness and your grace. And it is in your name, King Jesus, that we all loudly said, amen.